An Applied Scientific Hypothetical, written and read by Kitsune Baba. Chapter 1. Everything hurt. This wasn't the first time Izuku had woken up to find himself a patchwork of pain. It had been a regrettably common occurrence in his life, especially after inheriting One for All. When he tried to open his eyes, the light hurt so badly he had to shut them again, stifling a groan. Shit. He would owe his mother a huge apology after this one, if he was hurt enough to be photophobic. Steeling himself, Izuku tried again, blinking against the pain and the blurriness in his vision, until something, anything, came into focus. Thankfully, the roof was white. A curtain off to one side, various tubes set up around him. A hospital. Good. He didn't know what he would have done if he'd still been in danger. Carefully, he curled his toes, just checking, after a moment of panic, that he could. Even such a small movement took his breath away. He really, really owed his mother that apology. "Izuku!" Speak of the devil. The call was just a whisper, but he recognized it anyway. "Mom." He couldn't get out any more before his throat closed up with how dry it was. Gosh, how long had he been out? "It's okay, Izuku, I'm here," Mom murmured, and her hand stroked gently across his forehead, catching on the straps of the oxygen mask. With a slow sigh, Izuku let himself relax back into the bed. Then there was another voice beside him, clipping something to his finger. A doctor or a nurse? How did they get there so fast? "It's been half an hour, Izuku." Had he said that out loud? Must be on the strong stuff, to not even notice the passage of time. Already Izuku could feel himself being dragged down again. They probably gave him more medication to make him sleep. Clearly, he wasn't ready to be awake for more than a few minutes at a time. Really should find out what his injuries were. "We'll tell you when you're more awake," Mom murmured. Better sleep, he thought, before I say something embarrassing. A soft chuckle told him he already had. The next time Izuku woke, the light sensitivity was gone, as was the full oxygen mask, replaced by a smaller nose one. It still hurt to wiggle his toes, but at least the pain was more manageable this time. He also wiggled his fingers, just because he could. Mom was sitting at his bedside. He watched her turn the page of her book. She'd yet to notice he was awake. The usual streak of grey in her hair was gone. She must have given in and finally dyed it. Funny, he kind of missed it. At least she looked younger. It was something she'd been worrying about lately. Izuku made the mistake of offering suggestions last time it had come up. You'd think a 27-year-old would know better. He wondered briefly if any of his friends had come to visit. If Shoto had. Then again, if Deku was out of commission, they'd probably be needed to pick up the slack. There weren't any get-well cards on the dresser, at least anywhere he could see. That was odd, but not completely unheard of, especially if he hadn't been out for more than a day. How had he even been injured in the first place? While he'd forgotten specifics before, he'd never found himself unable to even think of the surrounding circumstances. Had he been ambushed? Was there a citywide crisis? Surely he would hear if there was too much activity outside. No reason to freak out, just ask someone later. There was a knock at the door before it opened to admit 2 people. One pushed a tray. Mom looked up at them, smiled, glanced at Izuku, then returned to her book, only for her head to shoot back up. In moments, there were already tears in her eyes, and she gently took up his hand. "Hello there! We noticed Midoriya-kun was awake and thought he might like to try eating something," the first nurse said, already setting up what was probably Izuku's next round of medication. Casually, her arm stretched to twice its length to collect his chart. Her companion unwrapped an ice lolly. It was probably some sort of electrolyte supplement, judging by the smell. Experimentally, Izuku tested his arms. One hurt too badly to move reliably, but the other was strong enough to accept the treat. There was some muscle aches from disuse, and it was perhaps a little emaciated. How long had he been here? But nothing worse than what he got on cold nights. Where was Shoto, the walking space heater, when you needed him? Hopefully he wasn't getting too lonely at home without him. If Shoto was even going home right now. He would need to call and make sure. Izuku suffered through being poked and prodded as he slowly made his way through the ice lolly. It wasn't particularly appetizing, but it did soothe his throat. There wasn't as much lethargy this time around, so he was fairly certain he wasn't muttering to himself accidentally. Each question was answered, out loud and as honest as could be. Then Izuku got his chance. There was only so much he could tell about his injuries by looking, and knowing could mean the difference between injuring himself further and making a full recovery. Bruising and lacerations on his skin was the least of it. As it turned out, he had broken both legs in 1 and 3 places respectively, mostly healed. Internal bleeding stopped. A scare around a blood clot in his brain, relieved with surgery, and a shattered right hand. They didn't elaborate. Good thing he'd been training up his left hand to write for the inevitable day he did this again. Recovery Girl always did say one more shattering, and he'd lose fine motor control. Izuku listened to the technical jargon, nodding along, though his mother looked lost. You'd think she'd have caught on through sheer repetition by this point. When they left, Mom turned on the television for him. It was playing some old sitcom he'd seen peripherally, because his friends had liked it back when they'd shared a dorm at UA. Right now it felt comfortable, so he let it go. There was no need to see the news just yet. Izuku drifted for a bit, until Mom had to go home to sleep. He bid her good night. She made sure the remote was near his functioning hand, that he had water, and then she was gone. It wasn't until later on, when he was alone, that he remembered he hadn't found out the date. Izuku was asleep before he could call someone to ask. The third time he woke up, things were different. It set Izuku on edge immediately. The chair had been moved away from the window, into a late afternoon shadow. Someone else sat in it, curled up. Ambient sounds came from the game system they held, hunched over the screen and aggressively hitting buttons. It took several moments before the figure looked up, noticing Izuku was braced on his elbows and watching intently. "You're awake," they said, and the hood pulled back just enough to see silver hair and one sunken red eye. Izuku didn't even pause to think. With a burst of power, he ripped free of his lines, leaving behind screaming machines. Bracing himself, he smashed through the window, heedless of what floor he was on. Thankfully, it was only the second. Practically nothing. One for All stuttered, and Izuku's heart almost gave out. He stumbled on impact, a quick roll, some thrusts, and he was on his feet again, adrenaline keeping him from feeling the new scrapes. He needed to get away from the hospital, somewhere without so many people. What happened to his mother? Was she all right? How had Shigaraki gotten past security? Izuku drew to a halt, lungs already screaming. How was Shigaraki alive in the first place? Calm down, Izuku, he told himself firmly. Compartmentalize. Deal with it later. First, find a hero or someone who will let you borrow a phone. Call it in, then keep running. There was shouting behind him, calls for someone to stop. Izuku ignored them. If Shigaraki wanted him, he could chase him. A 2-story fall wouldn't kill the man, if that's even what he was anymore. Could it have been a transformation quirk, an illusion? A distraction while someone else tried to hurt him? Regardless, he needed to sound the alarm and keep himself out of harm's way while he was too injured to put up a proper fight. One for All sputtered again, and Izuku almost collapsed. It must have been cushioning his legs far more than he'd expected. Earlier, Izuku had been able to listen to his extensive list of injuries without batting an eyelash. Now, though, even the mere idea that something could have happened to One for All had his blood turning to ice in his veins. If he couldn't use it, if he went back to being a quirkless little nothing... Compartmentalize, Izuku. Find help. He had no idea what time of day it was, but there weren't many people around. He dismissed the first pair as patients and changed directions, hoping to get well away from them. The second, however, was talking on his cell, walking briskly back towards the hospital. "No! Sir, I need to borrow your—" Izuku trailed off. Sunken eyes turned to him, framed by messy blonde hair. They stared at one another in stunned silence. "All Might," he whispered. Unbidden, he remembered the deceptively sunny day, the roses thrown onto the lid of the casket, the way his throat had closed up, and he hadn't been able to say all the things he'd wanted to. "There he is! Sedate him!" Izuku tried to fight the hands that held him in place, but he was too exhausted, too shocked. A prick he barely felt, and his vision blurred. Lifting his good arm with the rest of his strength, he tried to reach for All Might. All Might reached back. Izuku passed out before their hands could touch.